Welcome to this edition of American Purpose. My name is Jack Moline, and I am president of Interfaith Alliance. 60 years ago, Henry Luce, the publisher of Life magazine, invited 10 prominent men, each to compose an essay on the national purpose. Then as now, there was a sense that we stood at the beginning of a time of cultural and political change. Our project expands on that work as each episode explores one perspective on where our nation was, where it is, and where it should be heading through a contemporary thought leader's perspective. My guests are from the worlds of faith, government, politics, and culture, and they have generously agreed to share this time with us. You can find out more about Interfaith Alliance and our mission to protect your faith and freedom at interfaithalliance.org and by listening to our radio program and podcast, State of Belief, at stateofbelief.com. But right now, let's find out more about the American Purpose with my guest, the founding rabbi of ICAR in Los Angeles, Rabbi Sharon Brous. Welcome, Sharon.
Thank you so much, Jack. I'm really happy to be here with you.
Just so everybody knows, Rabbi Brous is coming off a month's vacation, well-deserved, and so we're the ones who are going to sort of shake her back to reality. So let's start with the first question. In your opinion, what was the original purpose of the United States of America?
Well, I think so much of what we're seeing and experiencing in this era is that there really was not one purpose at the founding of America, but really multiple threads that are often really contradictory in values. And so on one hand, there was the fierce desire to create a political and social space that would be free from tyranny, in which equality and possibility would be the driving forces of civic engagement and political engagement. I think this is the impulse that birthed those great documents at the founding of our nation, articulating the great aspirations of what it would really look like to build a nation on individual rights and the ability of each person to pursue their greatest dreams and aspiration. I think that thread of America's purpose is part of what held the imagination of millions of immigrants and refugees who really braved the journey to this place. Over the course of many, many years, because of the great promise it held. I think that is the dream that also stood at the heart of what so many people have fought and died for this country. I think this is a dream and a vision that's still worth fighting for, even centuries later. And it's a righteous dream, and it's not yet fulfilled. And I suspect that part of the reason, a very significant part of the reason that it's not yet fulfilled, is because it has been from even before the establishment of the state, dueling with a second very potent impulse, which really is a raw hunger for power and profit, which I think is very much also at the heart of the purpose of this nation from many of those who called this place their home. This is the willingness to do anything, no matter how heinous, to attain power and profit. We can attribute to this impulse the birth of white supremacy in this country, the caste system that has allowed the very same people who would write the words life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness to enslave, to rape, to force separation of parents from their children, loved ones from each other, that justify the genocide of indigenous people in this land, even after the abolition of slavery, that justified and permitted and fueled the reign of racial terror, Jim Crow, racial lynchings, and to this very day that persists in advancing an agenda of voter suppression, of mass incarceration, that is really the fuel behind much of the environmental devastation and degradation that the United States is responsible for, because the quest for power and profit is what has allowed corporations and individuals to degrade and abuse and destroy the earth. It is what justifies income inequality. It is what makes it possible for the wealthiest nation of the world, to have children who die because their parents can't afford proper medical care for them, can't afford good nutrition for them. This is the heart of the exploitation and cruelty and brutality that is very much a part of the American story. And I think in some way in our time, when we see the kind of battling between historians, between how we tell the story of America, and does that story begin in 1619 or 1776, part of what we're witnessing is a kind of battle between what we see as our core narrative. And in fact, I think both of those threads are part of the core narrative, and they're equally true, that the founding purpose of this country was at once the pursuit of a great, impossible democratic dream, unprecedented in the world, and also the quest for power and profit, which would be worse than a thorn in its side, and still unresolved to this day.
That may be the most comprehensive answer to that question I have ever heard. Very nice.
Well, I haven't talked for a month, so I've had a lot of time to really reflect.
So, given all of that, what do you think is or ought to be the American purpose going forward from this point?
Well, I spend a lot of time as a Jew and as a rabbi thinking about purpose and about core narrative, meta narrative, and story. And one of the things I worry about, and I know you do too, one of the things I really worry about is there or could there be a shared narrative, a shared sense of purpose for Americans who come from all different kinds of backgrounds, some who were brought here in chains, some who fled and came to this place, some whose dreams were realized here, and some whose dreams were stolen from them here. Some who lived in this place before anybody came over from Europe. Can we fathom a shared sense of purpose? And what excites me so much about America, and what makes me love this beautiful, broken, bruised place so much, I think is captured by something that Michelle Obama said a few years ago, when she famously said, and forgive me, I'll get the quote a little bit wrong, but she said something like, "This house that was built by the hands of enslaved people is now inhabited by the descendants of those very people." And I feel the shared narrative that could very well be at the heart of America's next chapter could and should be a narrative of redemption. It could be a narrative of look at how we started, not so that we can be ashamed by it, but so that we can celebrate the transformation that has been made possible in this place when we are truthful about where the pain point is, where the mistakes were, where the cruelty was, and how we grew out of that into a truly diverse, pluralistic, multi-faith, multiracial democracy.
That could be a very challenging and even threatening conversation for certain segments of our society.
It could be, and yet what I know from our shared tradition, Jack, about tshuva, about the process of coming to terms with past wrongs, taking responsibility, and really being transformed so that we can build a different kind of social and spiritual and political dynamic at the heart of our collective, is that it's absolutely possible. And the only way that we can heal is when we're honest about the past, right? Truth and reconciliation is sequential. You can't get to the reconciliation until you get to the truth. And many people have been talking about this for years. And yet we have taught a false history in this country because we're afraid that the truth will be so painful that people will hate themselves, instead of recognizing that the truth is actually what sets us free, that being honest about the dark heart of this country, which has always been a part of our story, that being honest about that is actually what will allow us to become who we can become in the world. So I'll tell you this little story. One Shabbat, it was Shabbat during the holiday of Sukkot, in the
Tabernacles,
fall.
for those of you unfamiliar.
Right. So this was in the fall several years ago, and my daughter invited over her friend for Shabbat dinner. And her friend came, and we sat outside in our sukkah, these little temporary huts that we set up in our backyard during this holiday. And it was beautiful. And there are like little twinkle lights all around, and you feel the outside, the air and the breeze. And we sang and we talked and we did a little learning together. And it was a beautiful night, just Shabbat dinner during Sukkot. And as my daughter's friend was leaving, she said to my daughter, and they were about 12 or 13 when this happened. She said to her, "Eva, you're so lucky that you have all of this. My family's just white." And it was so interesting because I don't think that my daughter or I had ever really thought of it this way. But as Jews, we have all kinds of beautiful, powerful rituals. We have stories that we tell. We have ways of gathering and sharing those stories over time. When we sit in the sukkah, we're remembering what it meant to leave Egypt and to travel for 40 years and to live in these temporary structures and be vulnerable to the elements. And that story gets built into our sense of being. And what we know from psychologists is that when you have a core narrative at your heart, it builds resiliency, it builds a strong sense of social cohesion, it builds a sense of purpose. But we as a nation don't have a strong core narrative. And I think a lot of what we're seeing in the American political upheaval over the last several years is that a lot of people feel like my daughter's friend said she felt. "You're so lucky you have all this. I'm just white." And if we don't work really hard now to build a sense of shared narrative, not one that obliterates our individual narratives, Jews will still hold their Jewish narratives, Muslims will hold their Muslim narratives, Black community will hold their Black, all of that still remains true. But if we don't work to build a strong shared bond of purpose that's rooted in a core story, we will destroy each other and ourselves. And it feels to me, that's why I keep going back to that Michelle Obama statement, because that's an idea that every single person in this country can be a part of. That's a redemption story that invites all of us to be part of the celebration. I think of that line from Psalms all the time, that after the long teary night comes the new dawn, the new joyous daybreak. And it feels like that's the kind of core narrative that we're going to have to develop so that we can all be part of a story of redemption, regardless of how our ancestors or we came to this place.
So let's get in the weeds a little bit about that. Our society rests on foundational values. Some of them are very admirable and some of them are not, as you've pointed out. What are a couple of those values that are worth doubling down on?
Well, I'll tell you, I've been thinking very deeply into the Jewish core narrative, which is the narrative of Yetziat Mitzrayim, of the Exodus from Egypt. And the values that emerge from telling that story again and again and again. And as you well know, I mean, we do a deep dive into that story every spring with Passover. But we also tell that story obsessively. I mean, we tell it every week when Shabbat comes in. We tell it 3 times a day when we pray. It happened 3,500 years ago. We're constantly telling this story. Okay, so what are the core values that come from this? Because I believe that these are both present in American political and social discourse and also need to be more so. So I'll tell you these are the 2 core values that I take from my own story that I think are worth doubling down on in this country that will help us very much as we work to really transform America into that multiracial democracy that I was talking about earlier. So one of them is a message of hope, which is in the deepest darkness, after hundreds of years of enslavement, if you think about the narrative that is posed to us, it's 4 of the 5 books of the Torah. And in only a few verses, we have hundreds of years of oppression, degradation, indignity, humiliation, human cruelty. And then when it's unimaginable that anything would ever change, when every person who's alive is a descendant of, every enslaved person is a descendant of enslaved people, meaning there's nobody who remembers freedom who's alive. And then just when it's, appears that nothing could ever change, everything changes. And God sees and hears and knows the people's pain and sends Moses to go partner with God in extracting this people. This is a message of hope. And I think in some ways, what the Israelites learned from that journey out of Egypt so many years ago is one of the core operating principles of America at its best, a narrative of hope. It's the same thing that drives people through really death-defying journeys to get to this country from Central America, where they're climate refugees who are escaping famine and poverty and violence. And why America? Because America is the embodiment of hope for many people. The sense that as hard and as terrible as things are here, it could be better. It's what drove my great-grandparents to come to this country from Eastern Europe, where they were fleeing pogroms and poverty, right? There is a spirit of hope that prevails in this country, despite everything. I honestly think it's what drove millions of people to the streets last year after the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, because we fundamentally believe that it can be better than it is. If we didn't, we wouldn't protest, right? We wouldn't have this incredible history of activism in this country if we didn't fundamentally believe that things could be better. There would be no feminism, there would be no racial justice movement, there would be no movement for LGBTQ equality and liberation, because we would just assume things are as they ought to be. But the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, my core narrative, our core narrative, is that even in the deepest darkness, there's the possibility of a new dawn. And that is one of the core values of this country. That's part of what makes me love this place. That spirit of resistance. I mean, I stood in Washington, D.C. in January of 2017 with 1 million people on the street and millions of people around the world. So why were people standing up and speaking out? Not just because we knew it was wrong, but because we had hope that it could change. Even if not that day or the next day, we knew eventually things would get better. So that's one of those values that we need to double down on. And hope, by the way, when Obama talked about hope, it was treated like he was just being a preacher and he wasn't being practical. But hope is not some kind of Pollyannish fantasy. Hope is actually, I believe that hope is the greatest expression of defiance against a culture of despair and pessimism. So hope is one, and the other is social responsibility. And I think part of the reason why for us as Jews, the narrative of the Exodus is so profound is because it gives us hope in moments of powerlessness and struggle. And it gives us a sense of obligation and sacred responsibility in moments of power and privilege. So the story speaks to us wherever we're perched. So the sacred responsibility piece is, do not oppress the stranger, for you know the heart of the stranger. You were strangers in the land of Egypt. And 36 times throughout the Torah, we're told how we are to treat and not treat the stranger based on our own experience. In other words, out of our struggle comes a sense of social obligation, social commitment. We were once enslaved in Egypt. And as Michael Walzer says, wherever you are, it's probably Egypt. Well, this place is Egypt for other people today. Maybe not for me today, but it certainly is for other people. So my work isn't done until I'm able to build a social reality that actually reflects those incredible, audacious aspirations that were realized in the course of my people's journey from enslavement to liberation, from degradation to dignity. I imagine if America doubled down on the values of hope and social responsibility, we would have a transformed, these are spiritual values, culture shifts. I'm talking about the way that we think about each other. Do we fundamentally believe that things can get better? And do we fundamentally believe that we're responsible to one another? Because what we see out there in America today, and part of what's so broken about this place, is that we're hopeless and we're individuals. We're individualists. We don't believe that it's our problem if I infect someone else with my virus. And yet there's this different thread, a different spiritual thread that also runs through the nation, that so many people hold, so many good people. And if we could double down on that, a sense of hope and a sense of shared responsibility to one another, I think we could transform this place.
So in the process of doing that, what are one or two of the values that are holding us back from necessary progress?
Well, I guess for the sake of, narrative thread of this conversation, I would say, what's the antithesis of hope and a sense of shared responsibility? Despair and individualism or greed, right? I mean, the despair, this is not accidental. We have been fed a politics of despair. We have been told that we are a failed society. From the highest offices, day after day, year after year. And that takes a toll. We have to be honest about what the Trump era did to us, not just politically, but socially and spiritually. We have been fed a culture of pessimism and despair. Everyone's talking about the polarization, but what I'm worried about is that it is so much deeper than the polarization. We've been taught to not to trust each other, not to trust truth, not to take care of each other, not to look out for each other. And in a society in which you have lost that fundamental sense, there's nothing left but despair, because there's no way to even imagine that something could be better than it is. So for the sake of sort of narrative thread, I would say if what we need to double down on are a sense of hope and social responsibility, what we need to actively work against is despair and radical individualism, which has been sold to us as the very essence of Americanism.
Right.
And I think it's a lie. Remember when Obama said years ago, and he said, "You didn't build that"? It was like, that was a presidential scandal, 8 years ago, or 10 or 12 years, whenever he said it. You didn't build it. But what he meant, he was actually right. None of us built what we did, what we've done on our own. I work very, very hard for what I have. I didn't build it alone. And so what does it mean to be told that you alone can fix it, right? This is the greatness of America, is our ability to build a collective that can actually work towards shared transformation. And so I'm very worried about I'm worried about that radical individualism. I think it's taking a massive toll. And it's also, I mean, aside from what it's doing to us politically, I think it's hurting our hearts. I think it's making us lonely. I think it's making us feel like when we're taught that we have to do everything on our own, I think it breaks us, right? And Vivek Murthy talks about loneliness as a pandemic of our time.
Yep.
Not only the pandemic of COVID, but even predating that, the pandemic of loneliness. Like there was some incredible study that was done just before the election last November that said that something like a quarter of all Americans don't have even one person in whom they confide, right? They don't even have one person who they talk to about their fear of getting sick, their fear of infecting their parents with a deadly virus, their worry about spending Thanksgiving alone. They don't even have one person. So what's happening is that this kind of radical individualism, Marlboro man, macho, toxic masculinity America, which was embodied in the office of the president for 4 years, but certainly predated him and certainly exists after he's gone, has also entered our spiritual systems, and it's eating us up. It's destroying us because it's a lie. And so I feel like we have got to address that at the heart. That's really the work of, that's the spiritual work of our time, helping us find our way back to each other.
So many people are focused on what their rights are. They focus on the Bill of Rights and particularly on the First Amendment. They have a tendency to overlook that the first word in the Constitution is we. Yeah. And that the entire preamble is focused on us as a community, not what I can get for myself. And it's an important lesson to start at the very beginning and not where it's convenient. And speaking of the Constitution, nice segue, most of our constitutional guarantees emphasize our commonality. But as I said, the first freedom in the Bill of Rights is very personal. It's the freedom of religion, the freedom of conscience. What values that are rooted in your personal belief system do you commend to those in this country who don't share your beliefs?
So I think I've shared a couple of them so far. I'll tell you one that I've been thinking about a lot lately, which is the very central teaching about Shabbat in our tradition, about the Sabbath. So it says in the Torah, Sheshet yamim tavod vasita kol melachtecha, v'yom hashvi'i Shabbat l'Adonai Elohecha. So 6 days do all kinds of work, and on the seventh day, that's a holy day. That's a day for God. And something I think a lot about is what it means from our tradition that we're orienting our lives around what Yitz Greenberg calls a rhythm of perfection. The idea that we live in a broken reality. Let me take a step back for a second. I mean, we've spoken about many of these things, but one of the core teachings, my core faith commitment, is that all human beings are created in God's own image and therefore have a right to live in dignity and to live with freedom and to live in peace. That core commitment is our reality makes a mockery of that commitment every single day. Poverty and violence and cruelty. And so how do you remember to hold that core dream, that like to cast your gaze at something better than what is, instead to what ought to be? The way that we do that as Jews is to engage the world for 6 days and do everything we can to fight to transform our reality. But then, v'yom hashvi'i Shabbat l'Adonai Elohecha, the seventh day, to pause and to remember what the dream is. And to say, I can't keep fighting every single day without tapping back into that spiritual sustenance that is the reason I'm fighting in the first place, the reminder of the dream of something better than what we have now. And I feel like that, I mean, that's distinctly Jewish, but it's also very applicable to our, to other faith traditions and also to contemporary society. It just makes good sense. When you're fighting to transform your reality, you have to give it everything you've got, but then you have to take a break and look at it and reflect and remember what you're actually fighting for. And I see this among many of my activist friends, this kind of deep, painful burnout that happens because you see how broken it is and you invest everything you've got and then you die. And I think that the practice of Shabbat is such a powerful one because you're actually, and when I started my Shabbat practice, years ago, I remember I calculated how many hours of work I would lose when I took on Shabbat practice. And, I was like a nerdy college student. And it was 13 hours in the library that I was going to lose by not working Friday night and on Shabbat. And I thought, like, how am I going to make up for 13 hours during the week? But I did it. I sort of did it as an experiment. And what I realized is that creating the space to sit with friends and family and eat a beautiful meal and not have my phone or my computer and talk about ideas and think deeply and reflect on where we've been and where we're going is worth way more than 13 hours. And so this is something that, what would happen if we actually built into the kind of spiritual life of our country the sense of really deep commitment to the work of transformation 6 days a week, tavod vasita kom lachta, do everything you can to transform your reality, but then take a step back, go back to the margins and see what you see, because it's very likely that you need that fuel if you're going to persist. And it's also likely that when you step out a little bit, you'll see things differently than you did when you were deep in the fight.
That's great. How should our society pursue its national purpose?
We should tell the truth. We should tell the truth about where we've been, about the mistakes that have been made, about, as many people are now saying, it's not that the criminal justice system is broken, it's working exactly as it was designed to work. We should tell the truth. We took our community just before COVID. We took, I think, 109 people from Ikar in Los Angeles to Bryan Stevenson's National Memorial for Peace and Justice and the Legacy Museum. And I think every American who can go needs to go, because what he's doing is helping us tell the truth. It's really hard. The truth is incredibly painful. There's a lot of responsibility that needs to be taken here. And yet I can't envision how we could fulfill our national purpose, how we could actually take the words that those slaveholders like Thomas Jefferson wrote, those beautiful words, and realize them in a way that perhaps he couldn't even have imagined if we aren't honest about where we've come from. And for me, the truth telling I understand that it's terrifying and it's also liberating. And what you can see is that people who are willing to tell the truth are not burdened by shame, but instead feel liberation, because this is the only way, I think, that we can move forward. And by the way, as you well know, Rabbi Moline, our tradition is very big on truth telling. And I think a lot about what it means to come from a tradition that says you could blame the Romans, but why don't you look at yourself? We could blame this oppressive military force that came in and destroyed everything that was holy to us. But what about the way we were treating each other? How did we contribute from the rabbis to the regular people, right? In what ways did we allow a kind of toxicity to enter our communal space that made us vulnerable to the Roman forces attacking us? And they do that without shame. It doesn't shame us. It liberates us, because then we can say we're not totally out of control here. It gives us agency. We can say our ancestors made these mistakes. Let's not make these mistakes again. And I feel that might be the only way forward for us as a country.
And how about the individual? What role does the individual play in pursuing our national purpose?
Well, the truth-telling certainly applies not only collectively, but also individually. But I'm going to add one additional piece. I really believe that we have a curiosity deficit in our country. I think maybe not just, I don't know if this is distinctly American. It's definitely American, but it might be true elsewhere. I think we're suffering from a curiosity deficit. I think we don't wonder about each other. We don't ask. We don't want to know. We judge. I think that on an individual basis, we have to practice the muscle of curiosity. How can we ask, examine, learn, grow, especially when we already know we're right? And this is really hard. And when I think about this, I don't think that this means that that there's no objective right or wrong, and that we should be trying to understand if the Nazis marching in Charlottesville also had a just cause. I don't mean that. I mean, on a human level, are we curious about our neighbor, about our family member, about the other? And I think that part of the way that we get to the truth-telling and the kind of national transformation is by wondering about one another. And recognizing that we're strong enough to ask the question. I'm not going to lose my Jewishness when I ask my pastor friends to really dive into their theology. It doesn't take anything away from me, right? I won't lose my core foundational social commitments when I ask political opponents to help me understand how it is that they can oppose abortion so fiercely and yet are in favor of the death penalty and don't want any restrictions on gun use, right? I don't lose anything by asking, and not asking so that I can prove that they're wrong or reinforce my narrative, but asking just to learn and grow. Mm-hmm. So I think the way that the individual can contribute to the broader kind of culture shift that we need to see in this country is by reclaiming our curiosity, working it, practicing it, asking it, listening, and then telling the truth ourselves when we're asked, not hiding from it, but expressing where the pain is, and expressing where the hope is. Because ultimately, I think hope is contagious. And as much as hatred is, hope is too. And so, like, being willing to open ourselves up to share where we see the real possibility.
So that's a great segue to ask you the last question, which is, are you optimistic about America's future?
It's my job to be hopeful. I mean, literally, we pay clergy to have hope when hope is gone. You know, I've had moments, especially over the last couple of years, where I have not been optimistic about our country and where we're going, because it's much more fragile than we'd like to think it is. Democracy is far more fragile. I believe on January 6th, we came far closer to seeing the end of this fragile experiment in democracy than we would like to believe. And you can't prove a counterpositive. It's very hard to do that. But there have been times where you can relate to this, but it's my job to show up on Shabbat and give people hope. And there have been times where, I spent Sunday through Friday morning full of despair and then had to really find strength somewhere, find the hope, not from a place of false, again, some kind of fantastical imagining, but from a very deep place of faith. And I do find it. I always can find it in the end, because I do fundamentally believe that the arc of the moral universe bends toward justice. I believe that this core story that we've been speaking about, the Exodus from Egypt, is fundamentally a story that planted in my soul the idea that human history follows a trajectory from darkness to light, me'afila le'ora, from narrowness to expansiveness, from degradation to dignity. I fundamentally believe that even though it's not a direct journey from enslavement to liberation, from Egypt to the promised land, that is the journey, that is the trajectory. And so I don't know what happens in 2022. I don't know what happens in 2024. And I know that real people, there are real world consequences to these voter suppression laws. There are real world consequences to every decision and determination that is being made. And yet, and that might mean that we have several years of struggle ahead of us. It's not over. And yet, I fundamentally believe that the overarching trajectory, both of my life as a Jew, but also the trajectory of this country, is one that moves me'afila le'ora, from darkness to light. And so am I optimistic? I don't know, but I'm hopeful. Even when I'm not able to grab it every moment, I certainly have moments of darkness and challenge, but I am fundamentally, I do fundamentally have faith that we will continue on this journey toward greater freedom, toward equity and equality, toward justice, and toward a more loving society. That's where we're heading. I don't know what the immediate years will look like in between here and there, but I know we're on our way to the promised land.
It's great. Thank you. And thanks to you, our listeners, for engaging with us in exploring the American purpose. It's been an honor and a pleasure to spend this time with Rabbi Sharon Brous, the founding rabbi of ICAR. You can find out more about what ICAR is and does at icar.org, ikar.org. And Rabbi Brous has a great TED Talk. Google it. It's worth listening to and watching. She shared her perspective so generously with us, and part of a very busy schedule. You can listen to this and other episodes at americanpurpose.org and learn more about our work at stateofbelief.com and at interfaithalliance.org. Interfaith Alliance has produced this program under the guidance of Ray Kirstein. I am Jack Moline, encouraging you to live with purpose.